right, we are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for tuning in today for our HealthLinks webinar series. My name is Katie Guthmiller. I'm the program coordinator here at HealthLinks, and we're very excited to be partnering with Tri-County Health Department to bring you this webinar, When Good Intentions Aren't Enough, How Racism Persists in Today's Workplaces. I wanted to start by telling you a little bit about us, who we are. We are a mentoring program that champions health and safety at work. We do this by providing evidence-based healthy workplace certification, as well as one-on-one advising to help organizations and their team members achieve total worker health. We are a nonprofit based at the Center for Health, Work, and Environment at the Colorado School of Public Health. Those of you who are in our HealthLinks network are probably familiar with our HealthLinks benchmarks. These are the 6 different areas that we assess and advise on as a part of HealthLinks. I wanted to point out that today's topic of racism in the workplace would fall into our engagement benchmark, where we discuss diversity and inclusion, but also wanted to mention that this topic is really applicable to all of these benchmarks and is definitely something that we want to consider in each level of planning, implementing, and evaluating health and safety programming. As I mentioned, we're excited to be partnering with Tri-County Health Department on this effort, and we have Michelle here from Tri-County. So Michelle, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Katie. Hi, guys. Tri-County Health Department is the largest local health department in the state of Colorado, and through a grant from the state public health department, we have collaborated with HealthLinks, and we have formed 5 local employer coalitions to provide a little more intense support. So we convene them monthly, share ideas and resources. We have a lot of funding for them, and then we also are able to provide them with free certification or free assessment, access to the assessment tool for HealthLinks. So that's a major perk. The majority of our 100 employers are certified by HealthLinks, and we're just really happy to be partnering with HealthLinks, especially on this exciting webinar. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Michelle. All right, quick agenda for you all. We will first have a presentation by Dr. Adia Harvey Wingfield, who I will introduce in just a moment. Then we'll have a live Q&A discussion, so this is a great opportunity to ask any questions that you have. And we have Dr. Katie Dickinson from the Colorado School of Public Health here to moderate that for us. And then I'll be popping back on just to do a quick closing and tell you a little bit about what's coming up next. Some general housekeeping before we get started. All participants will be kept on mute throughout the duration of the presentation. Please use the chat function for any technical issues that you're having, and we have a team here ready to help you. If you have any questions for our speaker or topic-related questions, though, please use the Q&A. This is where we'll be gathering all of our questions for the discussion later on, so definitely utilize that. Also wanted to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube. We'll be sending out the link to that in the follow-up email, which will go out tomorrow, along with a link to the presentation slides and information on how to claim continuing education credits. Also wanted to mention that there's a survey at the end of this webinar. We would love if you could just take a minute to complete this. It's really short. Just helps us to get some feedback and inform our future webinars. So we'd really appreciate that. And I also wanted to mention, if you're looking for a certificate of attendance, you will need to take this survey at the end and fill out your information, and that will be auto-generated for you. If you are looking for SHRM and CHES credits, they are available. Again, information on this, on how to claim these, will be going out tomorrow in the follow-up email. So definitely keep an eye out for that. And if you haven't gotten the follow-up email by Wednesday, definitely reach out to us. All right, it is my privilege to introduce to you all Dr. Adia Harvey Wingfield. Dr. Wingfield is a professor of sociology at the Washington University in St. Louis. Her research examines how and why racial and gender inequality persists in professional occupations. Dr. Wingfield has lectured internationally on her research in this area, and her work has been published in numerous peer-reviewed journals, including Social Problems, Gender and Society, and American Behavioral Scientist. She is currently president-elect of the Southern Sociological Society, one of the largest regional sociological associations in the country, and is a regular contributor to Slate, The Atlantic, and Harvard Business Review. Professor Wingfield is the author of several books, most recently Flatlining, Race, Work, and Healthcare in the New Economy, and is the recipient of the 2018 Public Understanding of Sociology Award from the American Sociological Association. We're so excited to have Dr. Wingfield with us today, and Adia, go ahead and take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, first, for having me and for this invitation, and thank you to everybody for attending. This is a welcome version of something that I haven't been able to do in a long time, which is to feel like I'm in the classroom communicating information. I haven't done that since March, so this is a good way to kind of ease back into what I do with a lot of my time under a bit of different circumstances. So thanks, everybody, for your time this afternoon. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that you can see the slideshow to which I'll be referring. So hopefully what you're seeing right now is a screen that says, "When good intentions aren't enough, how racism persists in today's workplaces," which, as you know, will be the core topic that I'll be focusing on today, and running over a bit of the research in sociology that does talk about how and why we continue to see racial inequalities and disparities present in our workplaces and in occupations. So when we think about these questions related to race, work, and organizations, just as an overview, we're at a point now where many organizations are really starting to wrestle with how to address race and racial inequality in their workforces. And we know, for example, that when we look at organizations at the top level of virtually every organization and industry, what we do find is that workers of color, particularly but not exclusively Black workers, are largely underrepresented in leadership. And this is the case whether we are looking at the political sector, whether we're looking at the media, whether we're looking at academia, whether we're looking at the legal sphere. Across organizations and across industries, the consistent kind of common ground across all of these industries is that we're likely to see workers of color who are not represented in decision-making roles and in the most influential parts of organizations and leadership. A comparable study showed a while back that there were actually more men named John in leadership in many organizations than there were women of all races. And certainly I think a parallel argument could be made for workers of color. So we know that there is this real disparity between what our population looks like and what leadership looks like, and how we see a real disparity between those who are at the top levels of organizations and racial equity. So some of the core questions that many researchers have asked are how racial inequalities are present in work. What if we know that organizations are spaces where racial inequalities can persist, not just when it comes to leadership, but when it comes to everyday experiences, when it comes to relationships and ties to others in the workforce? How are racial inequalities present? What does this look like? What do these inequalities, how do these inequalities appear? And the second, maybe even more important question that relates to that is what organizations can do about it. So in the course of this webinar, I'll talk about both of these issues, what the research has shown us in terms of how racial inequalities are present in the workplace, how those inequalities emerge and continue to persist, what sorts of organizational patterns and practices give rise to these inequalities. And I'll conclude with a little bit of discussion about things that research has shown are organizational strategies that can be used to move past this and to try to move to a space of more equity. So here's a brief overview of some of the challenges facing workers of color. And this is by no means an exhaustive list, but these are some of the areas where I think research has yielded the most information and given us the most detailed data about what these challenges are and what they look like. There's a study by Bellin and Como called Our Separate Ways, which focuses a lot on stereotyping among workers of color. This study focuses particularly on comparing Black and white women in executive and management roles and highlights the way that stereotypes are present for them. But certainly these issues of stereotyping are present as well for other workers in other contexts and settings. This is by no means exclusive to Black women working in executive and management roles. I also want to talk about some of Joan Williams' research. Joan Williams is a law professor at UC Hastings who has written about the difficulty accessing mentors and sponsors. And I'll talk about the differences between those two terms in the first place and how difficulty accessing mentors and sponsors becomes a challenge for workers of color in many organizations. My colleague Sadali Malaku has written a great recent book called You Don't Look Like a Lawyer about Black women's experiences in the legal field, where she talks a great deal about this challenge with perceptions of fit, these abstract often ambiguous ideas that we have about who really belongs in certain professions and certain high status roles, but how our ideas about who fit those jobs can be detrimental when we're trying to create more racially diverse workplace environments. My colleagues Diva Pager and David Padula have also written about this question of social networks and how our relationships and ties to other people have an impact on hiring in ways that, again, can be detrimental to producing more racial diversity in our organizations. And they've talked about how this has occurred in a number of different ways that I'll add to during this discussion as well. And finally, there is the glass cliff phenomenon, which is somewhat parallel to the glass ceiling term that I'm sure many of us are already familiar with. I'll say a little bit more about how this glass cliff phenomenon can have an impact for workers of color as well, then conclude with a little bit of discussion about Black workers specifically today in our current work environments and some recommended readings if anyone's interested in following up on this topic further. So I want to start with this question of stereotyping, because I think that the research indicates that when we're looking at some of the challenges that workers of color face in contemporary environments, often this issue of stereotyping can be a really big challenge for workers across the board. It limits opportunities, it minimizes access to broader avenues that could be routes for success for workers of color. And it is really insidious because it often is implicit and unspoken or not explicitly spoken in ways that can really work to the detriment of workers of color. In a study, a bit of an older study from 1997, sociologist Ivy Kenneling has shown that one of the major stereotypes that impacts Black women is that they are often seen as unreliable employees. In a study of hiring managers, Kenneling found that many white employees assumed that Black workers had what they referred to as, quote, that single mother element. And this is actually the title of this article published in the journal Gender and Society, where assumptions that Black women would be single mothers or would have family structures and formations that would keep them from being reliable employees worked to the detriment of these women workers. And importantly, this was a stereotype that applied whether or not they even had children, whether or not they had adequate family support to balance work and parenting. The stereotype of Black women as unreliable employees due to assumptions about their family formation and family structure was sufficient enough to create discriminatory processes that made it more difficult for these women both to be hired and to flourish in jobs where these managers were in charge. Research has also shown that Black men are likely to be stereotyped as people who lack soft skills. And when we talk about this question of soft skills, this refers not necessarily to the explicitly stated, clearly identified skills that a worker needs to have in order to succeed in a profession, but the softer, more nuanced and ambiguous aspects of kind of human capital, right? So for example, if my job is to work as an engineer, the hard skills required with my jobs would presumably require a very high level of math skills and an ability to calculate complex equations and so forth. But the soft skills associated with that job might be the ability to work collaboratively with the team and the ability to motivate people to want to work on a project. Moss and Tilley have shown that in many cases, Black men are seen as lacking these soft skills, or are stereotyped as lacking these soft skills of being people who are team players, people who are genial, people who are convivial colleagues who can work well with other people. Interestingly, in my own research, one of the things that I learned in researching my book, No More Invisible Man, was that Black men were often hyper aware of the perception that they could be seen as, quote, angry Black men, and often worked really hard to offset that stereotype by being overly friendly, overly genial, and overly accommodating to many of their coworkers. So I bring that up just to reiterate the importance of being mindful that stereotypes often are not rooted in reality or evidence. They are a shorthand way of making decisions about different aspects of our lives. In the work context, these stereotypes can be really detrimental, though, to Black workers. I also want to talk about how racial stereotypes can have an impact on workers from other backgrounds of color. Rosalind Chow has shown that white managers often stereotype Asian American men as being too passive and docile for management roles. This is where the stereotype of the model minority of Asian Americans works to their detriment, research has shown. Stereotyping Asian American men as being people who are passive and easygoing means that in many cases when job openings are available for people in management who need to have a killer instinct or seen to be very aggressive, means that Asian American men frequently are discounted because they are stereotyped as people who don't fit that. Eileen O'Brien has shown that Latinx workers get stereotyped as unintelligent and also stereotyped as perpetual foreigners, people who are not American citizens and exist outside the bounds of legal citizenship. What this ultimately means is that these stereotypes create access in accessing leadership roles. Garcia Lopez has shown this in her study of Chicana attorneys, but I think that her conclusions are supported by research across the board that show that ultimately racial stereotyping in the workplace feeds into and is drawn from broader pre-existing stereotypes of workers of color in ways that ultimately may differ depending on the racial group in question, but at large serve to reinforce this idea that workers of color are not suited for high status, prestigious, influential positions, and certainly less suited for management roles. I'll move on now to talk about this question of mentoring and sponsoring. This is an important distinction in research because it has important implications for how many workers advance, not the number of workers that advance, but the processes by which many workers advance in organizations. So when we think about having a mentor, often that's cast in pretty wide terms. The mentor is the person who looks out for you and creates opportunities and can give you feedback and guidance and so forth. But really, research has shown that there are differences in how mentoring and sponsorship emerge and the role that they can play for workers in certain settings. Specifically, mentors are those who are there to provide guidance to you. They give you feedback, they give you responses to ideas that you may have and so forth. But sponsors are the people who create opportunities for you. So by way of example, I work at a university as a college professor. My mentors in that space would be the people that I might go to and say, here's an idea I have for a research project. I'm thinking of doing X, Y, and Z. Do you think this makes sense? Can you take a look at this draft of a grant proposal that I'm putting together? Can you give me some ideas for how best to do this project in a way that's really going to make it work and make it really worthwhile? The mentor, by virtue of the relationship that we have, provides me that guidance. But the sponsor is something different. The sponsor is the person who, when they are in meetings where I'm not in the room, the sponsor is the person who says to other colleagues that they are having conversations with, well, we've been talking about having someone to serve as the vice dean of such and such, or we've been talking about somebody to serve in an associate provost role overseeing this particular initiative. Adia would be a really good person for that. She's demonstrated an interest in leadership. She's demonstrated that she's able to juggle multiple tasks. I think we really want to think about putting her in charge of this particular opportunity. So we can see how mentoring and sponsoring are related, but they don't necessarily do the same thing. The sponsor is the person who, if you'll permit my borrowing from the musical Hamilton, the sponsor is the person who can make sure that you are in the room where it happens, because they are the person who has that power to put you in line for those types of opportunities. A mentor doesn't necessarily do that. What research has shown, is that for many Black workers, it's very difficult for them to secure either. And often this happens because managers look for people who remind them of themselves. This is a perfectly natural human instinct. This makes a lot of sense in many cases. But what Joan Williams has shown through her research, and what other researchers have shown, is that when we have a lack of racial diversity among management positions, when managers are mostly white men, in some cases, looking for people who remind them of themselves can blind them to Black workers who could potentially be people that they could mentor or sponsor, and who really have a lot to contribute to the organization, but simply get pretty easily overlooked. Research has been less comprehensive in showing this for other workers of color, but there is research that suggests that certainly this isn't a pattern that's exclusive to Black workers. This certainly exists for workers of other racial backgrounds as well. But it's really important when we think about upward mobility and how people advance through the ranks of organizations to be mindful of how much mentoring and sponsorship matter and how difficult it can be for workers of color to advance via those processes when management and sponsorship is often something that occurs, again, through very informal processes and through routes that people are left to shape and determine on their own. Just as an aside, there is a research study that does show that formal mentoring programs can have some modest effects in creating more racial workplace diversity for Black women. That research has not shown that formal mentoring programs necessarily show the same outcomes for workers of other racial and gender groups. So that research does not show that formal mentoring programs really move the needle for Black men or for women of other races. But that is some work that does indicate that there may be some efficacy to formal mentoring programs and what they can do to some degree for Black women. I'll talk now about this question of perceptions of fit. And when we talk about fit, this again refers to the more ambiguous or implicitly defined aspects of how we decide who is best suited for a certain job, who is best suited for a certain role in an organization. Often we'll hear people say when they're talking about admitting people into a certain program or hiring people for a certain position, I'm not quite sure. There's something about this person. I just don't think that she quite fits what we're looking for. There's something where I think the fit is off. Statements like those are fairly common. Often what research has shown us is that managers' ideas of who seems suited for high-ranking jobs can frequently exclude workers of color. When we allow organizational decisions to rest on this question of perceptions of fit, often these questions of fit and who seems to fit a position can very subtly work to exclude workers of color who otherwise would potentially be very strong candidates. My colleague Lauren Rivera has shown in really interesting work in a book that I highly recommend for everyone called Pedigree, that often these ideas of fit can be based on cultural clues, more so than they are based on explicitly racial ideas of how a particular candidate is best suited for a job. So in a study of elite professional services workers, lawyers, consultants, and financial executives, in looking at the hiring process, what Lauren Rivera was able to show was that hiring, first of all, was decoupled from HR management. Hiring typically happened vis-a-vis managers who were already in the jobs for which they would be hiring their colleagues. And in those jobs, managers usually weighed personal and subjective factors much more so than they weighed explicit objective criteria. So what it would ultimately come down to were managers thinking, is this person someone like me? If I were stuck at the airport and there was a layover, is this a person that I want to deal with for 4 or 5 hours while we're trying to get back to the office? If I had to make a long car ride with this person, would this be a person that I'd want to be in the car with, or would this be someone that I would just find very difficult to work with? And the way that managers often made those decisions was by using cultural cues about whether or not the potential worker fit into the organization. Cultural cues that were given more weight and more significance were when people expressed interests that often are those that are more easily enabled by an upper middle class lifestyle. So people who played, for example, squash or lacrosse got more of a benefit than people who played pool or basketball, or people who engaged whose preferred sports included boxing. These aren't necessarily criteria that indicate a person's capability for succeeding in a job, but they were cultural cues that Rivera argues help to weed out workers of color from having access to these high status professional positions. Law professors Devin Carbato and Mitu Jalati have also argued that the presence of ideas of fit and who is perceived to fit in a certain job works to the detriment of underrepresented workers, because they find themselves having to do a lot of what these legal scholars refer to as identity work, of managing the stigmatized or detrimental identities that are attributed to them and trying to offset the perceptions that people may have of them as certain workers. So for example, we see a lot of this today in the research and discussion about women attempting to work in highly male-dominated corporations, and the expectations that women will be disproportionately focused on family and balancing family needs and work needs. Carbato and Gelati argue that women do this identity work of showing that they are actually committed workers and that they are actually people who believe in working hard for the job by trying to offset and manage that stigma. Maybe they work even longer longer hours than they normally would. Maybe they don't mention that they have families. Maybe they make it a point not ever to leave early to do basic work for children, because they are doing this identity work of trying to offset the stigma that they have. But as these legal scholars also argue, doing this identity work can make it really hard for workers to present themselves as someone who fits the profile for leadership positions. In other words, if an informal and unspoken part of your job consistently consists of trying to disprove stereotypes and to work extra hard to show that you're somebody that belongs in leadership roles or belongs in the organization itself, then this adds to the burden of what workers are already doing. It creates an additional extra layer of work. And as Carbato and Gelati have theorized, in many cases can create environments where there's a no-win situation for many workers. If they try to offset one stereotype to prove that they fit, they end up incidentally proving another one. So it becomes a real double-edged sword of workers trying to show and prove that they belong in organizational spaces. I'll talk now about this question of social networks and hiring. And this is where we've seen a lot of really interesting research that shows that, again, aspects of how we work and how we get to work are not necessarily as innocuous as we might think. Pretty convincingly, research has shown that in this day and age, in our current economy, people are often very likely to find work based on connections. The very old model of perhaps people finding jobs through classified ads or through personal ads or whatever, seeing ads is listed in a place and going in and applying, that's pretty much done. We don't really do that anymore in an internet age and in an advanced age of technology. What happens more frequently is that people are referred to potential positions based on networks and connections and colleagues that they have. Sociologist Mark Granovetter has referred to this as the strength of weak ties, which is the argument that the loose connections that we have to people can actually be really beneficial for connecting us to people who may be able to advance us further. And the logic behind that is that my strong ties might be people in my family, my immediate friend circle, but we're likely to know many of the same people and have very dense networks. But if I'm in an environment where my neighbor's cousin works at the White House, then that puts me perhaps in a better position of getting a job there than not knowing anybody in those circles. If my neighbor's cousin works at the White House, presumably that cousin might be willing to put a word in for me at my neighbor's behest and suggest me for an internship or for an open analyst position. Getting out of my depth of my examples here and showing that I don't really know a lot about what potential jobs at the White House could be, but hopefully everybody sees where I'm going with this. What research shows, however, is that white workers are often more likely to refer other whites for these positions than they are workers of color. In Deirdre Royster's study of Black and white high school boys in a shop class, pursuing shop and trade work, what she shows is that white teachers were a lot more likely to refer their white students for jobs that paid better, jobs that held more potential for more security, and in some cases were a lot less likely to refer many of their Black workers at all. And this was the case when everything else held standard. Black and white workers expressed similar interest in jobs, presented an interest in working for the same wages. Consistently, these white teachers were a lot more likely to refer their white students. Now, some of this is a function of insular social networks. Research has shown that for many whites, social networks and social relationships are likely to be largely homogenous. Our neighborhoods still remain largely racially segregated, so do our schools. This can have implications for who is in our networks and who we even know to be able to refer to a position in the first place. But in more recent research, sociologists Diva Pager and David Padula have shown that even when Black workers are referred, employers are less likely to act on those referrals. So in as much as we continue to put this emphasis on social networks as a way that people find access to jobs, that process still can serve to reproduce racial inequalities, and that certain groups are a lot more likely to be excluded and left out of those networks and left out of the actions to make referrals based on those networks. I'll turn now briefly to this concept of the glass cliff phenomenon. This idea of the glass cliff, as I mentioned before, is somewhat of a parallel to the glass ceiling term that probably many of us have already heard of. When we talk about this glass ceiling, The glass ceiling refers to invisible organizational limits on upward mobility. It's this idea that workers may advance through an organization to a certain point, but inevitably they kind of butt their head against an invisible ceiling. They may not achieve past middle management levels. They may not achieve past lower management levels in some cases. And the glass ceiling concept refers to this idea that workers can see the levels operating above them, but there are these invisible barriers that keep them from actually accessing those levels of the organization. The glass cliff concept, coined by Ryan and Haslam in 2007, refers to the process where underrepresented groups are given leadership roles in times of crisis. So what they argue happens here is that in many cases, when leaders of color, when women leaders, who are the focus of their research, do have access to leadership roles, it's more likely to be when an organization is already in a period of crisis and about to go over a proverbial cliff, when things are in really bad shape already. This is when organizations may say, well, now is the time that we will give this particular person a chance. We haven't done so before, but we'll give this person an opportunity. As you might imagine, this can be a bit of a mixed bag. If that underrepresented person comes into the job and is able to turn things around, they've pulled off an incredible miracle and they've done something amazing. But if they aren't able to, and if they aren't able to make changes to the organization in a way that allows them to save that organization, then what can end up happening as a result are workers from that underrepresented group not being given more chances, because the idea becomes, well, we gave them a shot, but they didn't pull it off and they weren't able to make the changes that they said, without there being attention to the structural barriers or the structural impediments that were present for that worker in the first place. The research here in the Ryan and Haslam piece focuses specifically on women, but my own research has shown that this can have some applications for men of color as well, as being people who are hired under these glass cliff circumstances. As an interesting aside, the example that I like to give of this for my students is often the US election of Barack Obama in 2008, which I think really fit this example really clearly. This was a case where the US was certainly in a bit of free fall and crisis leading up to the 2008 election, and took the opportunity to elect our nation's first Black president, who certainly took on a leadership role at a time when things were not great for many of us in terms of the US's financial instability and the economic collapse that was happening leading up to that election. So I'll give a couple of discussion points about where Black employees fall today, relying on some of my own research. My most recent book, as Katie mentioned, is a book called Flatlining: Race, Work, and Healthcare in the New Economy. And flatlining is a study of Black healthcare professionals. It includes doctors, nurses, technicians, and physician assistants. Because I wanted to focus on how changes to the healthcare industry had an impact on Black workers, but I really wanted to wrestle with larger questions of how changes to the way that we work were having an impact on Black professionals today, right? So we know, for example, that the models of how we work, as I mentioned before, have changed. Not only do we no longer use classifieds to find jobs and access jobs, but the ways that we work are no longer the ways that we worked in the middle of the 20th century. There's not this model anymore where people go to work for one company and they stay there for the duration of their careers, and at the end they can count on retiring with a healthy pension or retirement package. They don't necessarily work for companies that will allow them to raise a family on one salary anymore. And significantly, the organizations where people work are not ones that as they did in the past would explicitly rely on racial and gender segregation to find workers, right? It wasn't uncommon in this period of time in previous eras for jobs to be explicitly or implicitly racially segregated by design. So we have a work environment today where people change jobs a lot more frequently. The public sector that offered a lot of opportunities for employment and for educational training has shrunken significantly. Workplaces often talk more now about wanting to have more racial diversity. All of these are changes from our older models of work. And I really wanted to think about what that meant for Black professionals and Black workers today. And what I argue in the book in Flatlining is that these changes to how we work have resulted in kind of a mixed picture for many Black workers. What I found is that for many Black employees, they work in organizations where there is now more of an explicit focus on and attention to these questions of racial diversity. In other words, organizations are a lot more likely now to say, diversity is something that matters to us and it's important and we want to have more racial diversity, or we at least want to acknowledge the importance of racial diversity. But I show in the book that when organizations make these promises but don't devote commensurate resources and internal support to achieving those outcomes, what I argue ends up happening is this process of what I term racial outsourcing, where organizations instead implicitly or explicitly task their Black employees with doing the actual labor of making organizations more welcoming and more accommodating to communities of color, whether those communities of color consist of workers or patients, as the case is for these respondents. What I argue happens is that when Black professionals are in these types of settings, they end up doing what I call the equity work of making these organizations places that are more appealing or navigable for communities of color. How that happens varies depending on whether we're talking about doctors, nurses, technicians. In other words, how that equity work occurs varies depending on the occupational category where workers are employed. It also varies depending on the race and gender of the workers, such that Black doctors who are women had different experiences than Black doctors who were men. The same for Black men nurses and Black women technicians, nurses and physician assistants. But ultimately, what I argue and what I'm able to show through this book ends up happening is that Black workers find themselves in these positions in these particular organizations where they're doing an extensive amount of additional labor to try to reshape and change these organizations, or at least make these organizations places where Black colleagues and consumers can flourish or deal with them acceptably. And this becomes an additional level of labor that gets done on top of the work that they are originally hired to do. And it creates a lot of burnout, disillusionment, and frustration. And I think these are important findings to talk about because they add some nuance to where I think our current dialogue and discussion is about Black workers. In other words, we know a lot and we've seen a lot about the challenges that Black workers face, some of which I've covered in this presentation, about these questions of stereotyping, perceptions of fit, and so forth. What we aren't talking about as much are the undue burdens that are often faced on Black workers to try to change these conditions. And this is a lot of what I talk about in Flatlining. And I find that this is a lot of where Black employees today spend a lot of their time doing additional work, again, on top of the work that they are already hired to complete. So let's talk now about improving outcomes for Black workers. This is more of the fun part, right? I talked a lot about many of the challenges that are present for Black workers, but fortunately, there's also a pretty decent amount of research that does cover and does show ways that organizations can make changes that have implications for Black workers and for workers of color at large. And some of these are included in the resources that I have listed at the end for further review. But a couple of specific things that can happen. One, organizations can actually put organizational resources towards creating more racial equity. This seems pretty basic and self-evident, but you might be surprised how many times this doesn't happen in organizational settings. There are a lot of times and a lot of cases where organizations have public statements that are very much in support of racial equity, not a lot of resources that go towards actually making those statements a reality. So one step that organizations can take to make these changes for workers of color is really to put these organizational resources towards this racial equity and not do the racial outsourcing and leave the equity work up to Black employees and employees of color. My colleague, other colleagues have shown that another strategy that organizations can take is to create external systems where workers can report issues without the threat of retaliation. This threat of retaliation, I think, is a really big issue that we perhaps have not spent as much time talking about in the research community, but that I think many workers know is a real concern that exists. One suggestion involves using employee resource plans as an external body by which workers can report issues without having to go directly to supervisors or to other departments that may not necessarily be seen as working for minority workers' best interests, but may have the organizational goals at heart, more so at heart. Organizations can also collect data and set targets for what they want to achieve. Again, this seems self-evident, but this often is not what happens in many organizational settings. As many of my colleagues have stated, the same way that organizations set metrics around other goals and set clear, specific goals around meeting certain targets, the same can be said for creating more racial diversity. Collect data about who constitutes your workforce. Collect data about where workers of color are employed and what segments and what sectors of the organization, and set clear specific targets for what organizations are going to achieve and by when. A 10% increase in this area, 15% increase in that area. These are things that organizations can do and again can devote their resources to achieving. Relatedly to this, research has shown that holding managers responsible for achieving these goals, particularly when these goals are centered around questions of racial and gender diversity, is often one of the few ways that we actually see these goals getting met. Once again, I'm aware that many of the solutions that I'm offering may seem like things that seem self-evident, right? Sure, duh, if we tell managers that you're responsible for achieving these goals, then obviously they'll achieve these goals. Not what always occurs in practice and in real life. But again, the research has shown that when managers are held responsible for achieving goals related to racial and gender diversity, this really is a big part of what makes the difference. Second to last, it's important to also involve managers in the solutions. Research has shown that simply telling managers what to do without their inclusion and involvement in creating these changes makes it a lot less likely that these changes will actually occur. And related to that, I think my own research has shown that it's really important to listen to the concerns of the workforce. And in particular, if we are talking about workers of color, it's important not to assume with too broad of a brush that they are all sharing the same considerations. My research here has talked particularly about Black workers, in part because that was the focus of my most recent book. But it's important to be mindful that even among Black workers, across the board, Black workers are not all having the same experiences. As my research showed, doctors have a very different experience than nurses. Nurses have a very different experience than technicians. And that's only within Black communities. So we can imagine that Asian American workers in these organizational settings would have experiences that to some degree differ from what their Black counterparts experience. Latinx workers, again, would have work experiences that differ to some degree from what their Asian American and Black counterparts deal with in the workforce. So it's really critical and necessary to make sure that as managers and as people who are in control in organizations, one of the strategies that can be taken is to really listen and collect data about the experiences and the concerns that the workforce is having, making sure to be attuned to how those changes can differ depending on racial background, based on gender, based on occupational status, and craft solutions that are really focused on addressing the issues that are present for workers in that particular organization. So I'll conclude just now with some resources for further reading to make sure that we have time for a little bit of Q&A before we conclude. The resources that I've included here include 2 Harvard Business Review articles and 4 books. The Harvard Business Review articles, the top one is one that I actually wrote about my own department, how we were able to build a racially diverse academic department in 5 years with the support of our administrative leadership, with the support of our departmental leadership, with resources devoted to this effort, and with an intentional eye towards making sure that we created a color-conscious department culture that would focus on race and not be a colorblind department culture that made discussions of these issues taboo, unwelcome, or unacceptable. The second piece here is another Harvard Business Review piece, and this actually was written by David Padula, who I mentioned in this presentation, that includes diversity and inclusion efforts that have been shown by research to work in moving the needle. I've included a link to my own book here, or mentioned my own book, Flatlining, which I just mentioned, as well as Acting White, Rethinking Race in Post-Racial America, written by the legal scholars Devin Carbato and Mithu Jaladu, who I mentioned before. Invisible Visits, Black Middle-Class Women in the American Healthcare System is a recent book by Tina Sachs that touches on what the topic suggests. And Black and Blue, The Origins and Consequences of Medical Racism is another book that talks about the history of these issues in the healthcare field. I'm happy to present other suggestions for people or to provide more details about the resources that I mentioned in the course of the presentation. But I hope that this can be the generation for future conversations about this and for people to build from what research has shown us to think about strategies and solutions that can be useful in our own workplaces. So I'll stop there to move to question and answer. Thank you, everyone.
Hi there, sorry about that. Okay, can you all hear me? Great. Well, I would like to start by just thanking you for this excellent presentation on a very important topic. Just one quick reflection that I had listening to this and from other things that I've been thinking about and reading recently is just how much many of us as white people are, you know, can move in all white spaces and not even notice it and not even see that as a problem. And so I think that, you know, what your talk it really highlights is that, you know, this is a problem. You know, this is a problem. We need to see this as a problem. We need to see this as a problem that it's not the job of people of color to fix on their own. They, you know, it's not, that's not a fair ask. So I really appreciate that. I think we can all in our various, you know, organizations, workplaces, understand how having a more diverse workspace would have very concrete benefits for us as an organization, whether that's in innovation or, you know, in just different perspectives and different areas of research that we might be doing. So I really appreciated that. So I'm going to start with one question that is sort of asking you to reflect. You know, you had this great list of resources, and there were several questions kind of about, you know, about resources. So I think that would be something that you know, we can hope to share those and any others in terms of trainings and other things like that. I think it can also be really helpful for people to hear about pitfalls, right? What are some things that organizations maybe try to do to address these problems? You've obviously talked about one in terms of, you know, the racial outsourcing and the equity work that we put on employees of color to address this on their own, but maybe you could just reflect quickly on any other, you know, don'ts. What are the things that you know, maybe would seem like a good idea to, but you know, you've seen in your work that, you know, maybe are not effective?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I didn't have a chance to address, but it's really important. So interestingly, and this worries me to some degree given where a lot of our current public debates about race and equity in the workplace are going. Interestingly, research has shown that while diversity trainings are one of the more common ways that many organizations try to address issues related to race and racial equity, more frequently than not, they do not work, which is interesting given how frequently they are used. But again, research has shown pretty clearly that when it comes to linking diversity and inclusion trainings and seminars to what actually happens in terms of moving the needle in terms of creating more racial diversity and more equity, diversity trainings are not an effective way of making that change. They often, this is because of a couple reasons. One is that they often are done kind of piecemeal, for lack of a better term. So many organizations will bring in a person to do diversity training, that's done, and that's the end of it. That doesn't seem to work. But they also provoke a backlash among many workers. Other colleagues have shown that, some of my colleagues have shown that for white workers, diversity trainings can create a situation where they feel resentful and they feel angry about being forced to be there and less likely to be open to and attuned to the comments and the information being given. My own research has actually shown that for workers of color, diversity trainings can produce a similar feeling of discomfort, but for different reasons. And what I found was that for many Black workers, diversity trainings produce a situation where they feel that they are expected to be in these rooms that are tense, where colleagues will sometimes say things that are explicitly upsetting or damaging or can be construed as microaggressions, but they aren't given the same leeway. There's not a sense that workers of color are expected to address the issues that may be really paramount and of most importance for them. And flatlining, one of the things that I also showed was that Black doctors were actually the least likely to be supportive of institutional efforts such as diversity trainings, cultural competence trainings, and things like that. And the reason for that was that they simply did not feel that this addressed the more systemic long-term issues that they dealt with as people who were workers of color in that environment. There wasn't a sense that diversity trainings or cultural competence trainings were really attuned to or designed for making concrete systemic change. So I bring that up because I think that particularly now, that's one of our easy go-tos, right? That people think about these issues in organizations and they think, okay, so there's this huge booming diversity business. We're going to get a trainer. We're going to get somebody to come in here and do a seminar. Research suggests that you might want to be cautious about doing that because that's not proven to really have any impact in creating more racial equity in organizational spaces.
Excellent, thank you. That's really helpful. One question that was posed by a participant is on the question of whether names of applicants impact hiring. So maybe thinking about that sort of, that applicant pool. Somebody else had a question about how to, increase diversity of the applicant pool, but sort of maybe at that stage, what does the research show in terms of how that bias plays in to the hiring process?
Yeah, that's another great question. There is a study in the American Economic Review by Marianne Bertrand and Mullinahan are the authors' last names, and I can't remember the first names because we always cite things by last names. But Bertrand and Mullinahan are the authors. The study's in the American Economic Review, and it's called "Are Emily and Greg More Employable Than Lakeisha and Jamal?" I believe. But if you Google Bertrand and Mullinahan, you can find it. It's an incredibly powerful study that shows that when managers are sent resumes that are identical, except for the names on the resume, they are more likely to offer callbacks to applicants whose names seem to signal a white identity than applicants whose names seem to signal that they are people of color. And again, the important thing to stress here is that these are identical resumes. It's not that resumes differ, that the resumes that they sent out differ in any way on educational background, years of work experience, and so forth. The only thing that made a difference in whether managers were more or less likely to respond favorably to these applicants or not was by virtue of what their names were. So research has shown that this, again, is an issue. Just in a broader picture, there's a lot of research that has documented that at this point of hiring, this is an area where we do see a lot of discriminatory processes occurring, whether it's through naming, whether it's through the reliance on social networks, whether it's through the reliance on cultural cues, like I mentioned before. But there's a pretty vast area of research that does show that our current hiring processes in many workplaces enough and spotty enough that there are a lot of ways that workers of color get weeded out at that very first point of contact, which is to say nothing of what happens once they are actually in the organization. So if you're in the mood for a little academic reading, I'd certainly recommend reading that piece. It's not too jargony, but it's really very valuable for the conclusions that the authors provide.
Great, thank you. The next question is, so the question that was posed is, in our office, the majority of leadership are white women. How do you recommend we navigate challenges with white female leadership in comparison to white men? I think maybe, this concept of intersectionality that you kind of touched on a little bit, how these different dynamics are likely to play out across both race and gender, as well as other identities. So yeah, just your reflections on that.
Yeah, that's a great question too. So intersectionality has been, I think, a really useful theoretical term in a lot of ways for pushing us just to think about how groups' experiences are not consistent across the board, right? So even in my own work, I've talked about how we can think about the gender wage gap as one example of why we want to think intersectionally about how these issues are present. Research has shown that, and we often hear the statistic that women make, I think it's 79 cents on the dollar for every dollar that men make, but that's only true if we're talking about white women. If we're talking about Black women, I believe it's 64. If we're talking about Latina women, I want to say it's 55 or 54. Don't quote me on that exact. But the point that the numbers vary depending on the racial group. So if we're talking about white women in leadership roles, I think it certainly is important, and it's hard to give more details without knowing more about the organization and the particulars of what field it's in. But generally speaking, I think that some of the suggestions that I was giving before still hold. It's useful to find out what experiences are there for the workers of color in this organization and in their employ, and to be mindful of how managers can be brought into this process of creating more racial diversity, even if the leadership team is white. In some cases, so I think you might find the argument from some people that for white women, experiences with gender discrimination may make them more attuned to and more receptive to the challenges that workers of color face. That actually hasn't always been shown to be true based on research, right? In fact, there are some studies that document the opposite, that for white women in leadership roles, some research has shown that they are not necessarily more likely to advocate for or create opportunities for other women of all races who are coming behind them, even if they have the opportunity to do so. So I don't know that I would necessarily assume that gendered experience transfers to being able to have some racial empathy, even though, again, it's hard to say without knowing the particulars of the organization. And without knowing that, I would say that I think it's useful when talking about these issues of creating more leadership, to gather as much data as possible about the experiences that workers are having in that particular setting, and to craft solutions that are attuned to what those workers are going through.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, and then I think this will be our final question, and it's I really like this question. So on this topic of, the not wanting to put all of the burden of solving the problem of systemic racism onto, Black employees or employees of color in the workplace. So at the same time, the question that was posed is, how can white staff put in the labor of health equity work in the workplace without coming off as a white savior?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what a great question. So one of the things that I started to feel really strongly about in doing the research and writing for Flatlining was how much the Black employees that I spoke to had ideas that were great solutions for changing these healthcare facilities and hospital settings. The problem was not so much that their ideas were poorly executed or the problem was that they were individuals who were trying to solve structural problems. And that just simply does not work. And I could not stop thinking about how the solutions that they were putting forth, had they been solutions that happened at the organizational level, could have been transformative, right? So there were so many respondents who would say, well, I'm putting together these fairs to reduce health disparities. And I've been mentoring people who are coming out of these areas who might be interested in healthcare work, to give them a firsthand view of what it looks like to be a doctor. Or nurses saying, well, I view my work as really being a change agent for these patients. And so I'm really committed to making sure that low-income patients of color have somebody who's advocating for them and somebody who's really doing the work. But the problem again becomes that these are workers who are part of a handful of workers of color in these hospital settings, trying to do things that the hospital or that the facility itself, to the extent possible, should be doing for the benefit of patients at large. So I think that for viewers who are white staff members who are in these settings and who want to be helpful, certainly there are a number of ways level. Being an ally can often include supporting the efforts that people of color are putting in, making sure that they don't get interrupted in meetings, or if they do, making sure that they get a chance to finish what they are saying, speaking up when you see something wrong happening so that they don't consistently have to be the person to speak up and raise these issues themselves. But we're still talking about what happens when we're dealing with everyday interactions. What I think is really powerful and really valuable is when people who are in leadership and management roles in organizations can say, okay, we see the work that, we see the equity work that communities of color and that Black employees in our organization are doing that. But how can we as an organization take that on? How can we implement an organization-wide mentoring program that reaches out to communities of color so that it's not up to our one Black OBGYN in this hospital facility to do this work? How can we implement, as an organization, fairs that are focused on reducing health disparities so that we are reaching out to communities that we know are likely to medically experience these challenges, so that it's not up to the one Black professor that we have in the radiology department to be responsible for this? So I think that for staff who are focused, who are in these areas and who have the wherewithal and the capability to do so, if you can change organizational policy so that you are making sure that the organization is focused on doing these things so that your Black professional colleagues don't have to, I think that's where we really start to see transformative change in organizations making huge steps in creating some difference rather than just leaving it up to a few people.
Wonderful. That's an excellent answer. Great. Well, thank you so much. There were a lot more questions. So this has really sparked a lot of interest. I'm going to hand it back over to Katie to wrap up and tell you kind of what comes next.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Katie. And thank you, Adia. That was a fantastic presentation and discussion. And thanks, Katie, again, for leading that for us. There were a ton of great questions. We really appreciate you all submitting those. Sorry we didn't have time for all of them. Wanted to let you know that you can reach out to us. I'm going to pull up some slides in just a second with our email. You can also respond to any email that you've gotten about this webinar. And we're happy to take a stab at your question or to pass it along to Dr. Wingfield if you would like a response from her. So just going to share the screen, just have a little bit more information for you before we get off today. All right. I wanted to let you know about a webinar that we have coming up actually next week on the 22nd on integrating worker health and safety, a safety practitioner perspective. We will have Dr. Mike Van Dyke from our center speaking on that, as well as some representatives from Comcast and Charlotte's Web, who are both organizations in HealthLinks, to talk a little bit about their experience. Wanted to also mention that CHES, SHRM, and CSP credits will be available for that webinar as well. We have a quick ask for you. If you are a Black-owned business, we would love to be able to chat with you about how we can potentially support you and your employees. So if you could email us at contact@healthlinkscertified.org, that would be fantastic. Lastly, just wanted to say thank you. Thank you again, Adia and Katie, for being on today. Thank you to Tri-County Health Department for co-sponsoring this webinar. Wanted to remind you that we do have a survey right after this webinar. If you could just take a minute to complete that, that would be great. There will be a certificate of attendance available if you complete that survey. For those of you who are looking for CHES and SHRM credit information, that will be going out in the follow-up email tomorrow, as well as a link to the recording, the PowerPoint slides, and the link to register for the next webinar that I just mentioned. Again, with any questions, you can reach us at contact@healthlinkscertified.org. And lastly, just wanted to mention too that we are doing a lot of work on COVID-19 and helping organizations through this time. So if you're having any challenges related to that, want to speak to an advisor one-on-one or get connected to resources, please reach out to us and we are happy to help with that. So we hope you have a great rest of your week, and thanks again for tuning in.